All right, let's pick up where we left off. Keep in mind, as I'm turning and looking all these different directions, I'm checking my notes. But I want to start back with Chapter 2 on page 281. There's a couple of terms you'll want to know from that. Again, if you've got your study guide handy, this will be very helpful to you. The first one from that particular page is the Black Codes, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. The Black Codes are essentially the South's way of overcoming the issues that are left with those civil rights acts. There's usually a lot of loopholes that we see in these first 2 or 3 incarnations of the Civil Rights Act, and that's why they keep having to enact new ones, because, well, there's some other way that the Southerners have overcome this and are still prejudicing against the blacks. And so the Black Codes are what we call those efforts by the Southerners to keep the blacks down. And it's based all on this idea that blacks are inferior to whites. And so that gives them power. And what they're doing is they're trying to limit human rights, those basic human rights, and to abridge the civil liberties of those blacks. They're just trying to make sure that they are kept under the thumb of the white man. Now, keep in mind, every state, these look a little different. So here's a couple of examples of what you might see in a black code. One state may say that you can't vote, you can't testify against whites, you can't drink, you can't smoke, you can't marry a white person. Might even dictate who you could marry at all, would limit your access to the court. It would even limit some blacks from hunting and fishing. And to me, these seem like such small things that really do define for us today, if we look at other countries and what they're doing against women or people of a different culture or ethnic background. These are basic civil rights that we expect should be honored for all people. And so these are obviously problems. The response is going to be the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Again, they're trying to close this gap or try to seal up that loophole that Southerners are able to get through as far as, well, we don't really have to give you that right because of this particular law. What we're seeing is states' rights versus federal rights, and that's kind of what we're getting to the bottom of right here. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 can be summed up in 4 parts. Number 1, it's going to reaffirm that on a state and federal level, you are a citizen of the United States if you're born or naturalized here. Period. It doesn't matter what color you are. It doesn't give that discrepancy. Number 2, no state, and this is where they're trying to, again, close up that loop. No state can discriminate against someone based on that before mentioned idea. They cannot abridge the rights and immunities of their citizens. Number 3, a person is not allowed to be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And number 4, a person could be denied equal protection. No person could be denied equal protection, which means essentially, if I get in trouble for something, if I break some law, the punishment for me has to be the same as it is for a black person. In that, if I steal a pencil from the bank, and a black person does it, they can't slap me on the wrist and hang that other person. And I'm being a little melodramatic, but hopefully you understand that to some degree, I'm not. These ideas are just ridiculous, and yet it was happening all the time. Now, I already mentioned in the last lecture that the South has been broken up into 5 districts or territories. These are military run. Now, we hear even in the news today that cities might be put under military rule. Particularly, the best example I can think of that's a little modern, although it's dating now, is post-Katrina, Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. They put it under what we might call martial law, so that we could keep from looting and rioting and all these things to try and protect the citizens that were still there. It's the same idea here, except for it's to really kind of subjugate the Southerners that are there, to try and reestablish their ability to be a part of the Union as a whole, but they're going to be ruled by Northerners. Remember, I mentioned that a few minutes ago in the last section. What we see coming out of this is a bill that's passed called the First Reconstruction Act, and we'll get to a few of those a little bit later on. But we also see the 15th Amendment come about, and we'll talk about, I think, 3 different amendments in this particular unit. The 15th Amendment, there's two portions of it. Number one, the right of citizens of the United States to vote cannot be denied or bridged. Essentially, we're seeing southern states coming up with ways to work around this. Now, this one has still got a pretty big hole in it because the Southerners were able to come up with literacy laws or grandfather clauses that if your grandfather was a slave, then you still are not fit to vote, those sort of things, which we'll figure out in years to come. But this is the first part of it. The second part of it is that Congress will have the power to enforce this law. What we're seeing up until this point is laws are being made that Southerners are basically going, that doesn't apply to me. Congress is saying, it does apply to you, and we're going to make sure that it does, and enough of this garbage. In this portion, you also see the formation of what we call the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK. Page 282, you see that there. You do need to know those amendments. You also want to know, what else did I mention? Black codes for your test. And you'll want to know the Klan for your test. Now, the Ku Klux Klan was founded in 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee. Pulaski, sorry. This is still there. That town is still there. Small little town. It was formed by a group of Confederate vets. It was essentially like a club. And I don't mean to kind of oversimplify it, and I really don't mean to make it seem like it's not a big deal, because it really is. But they really did start as just a group of guys coming together, talking, sharing experiences from the war, probably lamenting the loss, and it turned into this fearsome terrorist group that we have to deal with on two other occasions. There's three different incarnations. This happens to be the first. Essentially what they do is they organize into this terrorist group, which we would call them terrorists today. At that point, they did not. That was a term that they weren't really familiar with, I wouldn't imagine. They targeted freedmen, freed slaves, and anyone that was an ally to them. So, as a white woman, if I am encouraging or speaking out on the part of, or even educating a black person, I'm at risk of the KKK coming after me. It sought to restore white supremacy by any means necessary. And what I mean by any means necessary, I mean any means necessary. It doesn't matter if I'm white or if I'm black. If I'm in any way supporting or encouraging black rights, then I'm an enemy of the Klan. What we see here is the creation of something called the Force Acts. This was passed to protect the people that were harassed or harmed by the Klan, and then any other similar organization. Now, the Klan's the most well-known. It's one we'll talk about in this class more often, but there are others. There's other incarnations, but don't get the Klan confused at this point with skinheads and those that we're familiar with today. Those are different incarnations that will come along much later, and again, they would not consider themselves clans or part of the Klan, but rather maybe formed as an offshoot of. But we also see that these Force Acts are trying to prosecute those that are harming those people that it's trying to protect, which is a step in the right direction. Anything that's considered progress for blacks is going to be essentially hated by the Klan. On page 283, there's a couple of terms you want to know. You've heard of these, I'm sure. It's the carpetbaggers and the scalawags. The carpetbaggers are northerners who came down to the South. They stayed in the South after it was over, after the war was over, and they were, in theory, supposed to help the South, but really what they were doing is making a profit off the South's harms, or, well, their struggles. And so the carpetbaggers are really hated by these people. Now, the scalawags are Southerners who helped these Northerners. Now, part of Reconstruction was to help get the South back on its feet. And so what we see is Northerners who came down to be a part of that Reconstruction effort, for the good or the bad, because there's some that really are legitimately trying to help the South, and then there are some that are trying to make a profit. And then you have the Southerners that are helping those Northerners that Southerners just hated. So those are problems that we'll have to overcome in the future. We also see during this time period on page 284 the first poll tax enacted, and this is another way that the Southerners are going to try and keep the Southern blacks, the freed blacks, under their thumbs. They're basically going to say, we're going to discriminate however we want to, and you have to prove that you are able to vote. They don't want them to vote because they're going to vote in a way that's going to be somehow detrimental to the white cause. They're passing grandfather clauses. They're passing these poll taxes that you have to pay. Well, who has money at all? And particularly if you're a freed black slave, how is that possible? They have no money. They've never been paid for the work they're doing. The South's economy has completely been decimated. There's no money, and so they can't pay for that. And then, of course, I mentioned earlier the literacy requirements in some states, and it just depended on where they were as to what this looked like. So the next set of civil rights acts that's passed are in 1875. These are passed towards the end of Reconstruction, and we see the insertion again of one Charles Sumner. And if you took the first part of this class, 2 and 3, you learned a little bit about Sumner before this, which you ought to look him up. He's quite the character. But we see Charles Sumner trying to see if he can't find a way to bridge this gap. We're seeing a number of issues still in Congress of white men ruling the entire country, saying, we're not quite sure what this looks like. What does freedom look like? Who deserves freedom? What are the aspects of freedom that we're willing to protect? And Charles Sumner's trying to see if we can't get that all figured out. A part of the Civil Rights Act from this particular section, it's basically going to close a little bit more of that gap, that loophole I keep talking about. It's going to guarantee everyone, regardless of race or color or previous condition of servitude, that they are entitled to the same treatment, particularly in public accommodations. What this means is we're talking about theaters, we're talking about places of public amusement, like, well, theaters, as I mentioned, but anything, we're seeing fish fries segregated, we're seeing anything that can be separated out. The Southerners have already done it. And I should say, this is also happening in the North, but Civil Rights Act of 1875 is trying to close that gap. It's not only making these things illegal, but it's also saying this is the penalty. They could be fined anywhere from $500 to $1,000 or between 30 days to a year in prison for breaking this particular law. And so we see some incredible changes being put out even at this point. The next person you want to know for your test is President Grant. He comes in. He is an honest guy. Unfortunately, he's surrounded himself with some less than honest people. That's important because we'll see this happen several times during this course. You have probably a really good guy in office as president who brings with him less than honest guys who do dishonorable things, and it's going to taint the presidency. Now, Grant, he was a war hero. He's the guy that won the Civil War and put an end to the Civil War, and yet he feels so tied to the men that worked with him in the Army that he brings some of those guys with him, and essentially they all but completely brought down his presidency. He ended up bringing with him a Rutherford B. Hayes. After he is president, you see Hayes come into office. He's another Civil War veteran and a politician from Ohio. We see a huge concern as far as that particular election. He's the guy that's going to oversee the end of Reconstruction. Grant wanted to have that happen. It doesn't happen in his presidency, but it's Hayes that promises and then delivers. Hayes doesn't have a long list of successes as president, but Reconstruction ending is, in some regards, a plus or minus. And you could consider that. Think about why someone would not want to see Reconstruction ending. Well, you've got the carpetbaggers and the scalawags who are probably making some sort of profit off Reconstruction. And then even the southern states, as much as they hate the war and they hate the memory of the war, they are receiving some assistance to try and rebuild. But the other side of that is Reconstruction represents the failure of the Civil War and as well as a number of different social constructs that we won't get into now. Hayes also was a big proponent of education for both races, which is a huge, huge deal. He laid the groundwork for further civil rights reforms in the 80s and the 90s, and he pledged to support a wise and honest as well as a peaceful local self-government in the South. And that's a big step forward as well, because before this point we're seeing Northerners come into the South and take care of the Southern states for them. Now, when you head into chapter 3 on page 287, you'll see some terms that you are unfortunately familiar with, not the least of which is segregation and lynching. I do want to point out to you, I didn't get a chance to stick this in your book before I sent it to you, but there's some statistics I looked up as far as lynchings by state. And this is really fascinating to me because there's certainly a misunderstanding of who is being lynched and where and that sort of thing. And this particular information, it runs from 1882 to 1968. And it's got all the states listed. And there's some pretty big numbers on this particular one. One of the largest states as far as numbers goes of lynchings would be in Texas. Texas, they saw 493 lynchings in that time period. Now, it's also got it split up as far as white and black lynchings. In Texas, you see actually a pretty large number of white lynchings. Now, it's certainly not in comparison to blacks, but if you look at other states, it's really kind of interesting. They had 141 white lynchings and 352 black. Most of the states, when we look at it as far as percentage-wise, you're going to see a whole lot more black versus white. For instance, in Georgia, 531 lynchings total, 492 of them are black. So that kind of gives you an idea of what we're talking about. Louisiana, 335 of the 391 lynchings are black. And those numbers go on and on. Mississippi is one of the most notorious. Of the 581 lynchings, 539 of them are black. So this kind of gives you an idea. This is a very terrible, dramatic death that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. And it was happening far too often and really into too far modern history, if you think about it, for this to be even, it's just horrific if you think about it. What I do want to kind of hit on chapter 3 is this is a little bit about that age of Jim Crow, as the title tells you. And again, you already know that you should know Jim Crow is one of your terms. This is basically an idea. It's a practice or policy of segregating or discriminating against blacks in public places, public vehicles, or employment. And it's really it's disparaging. It's offensive to anyone that is black. And there's a number of ways that we can illustrate this. One of the ways your book points out is by blackface. And this is actually something that every time it pops up in the news today, because it still does happen, I'm just horrified. I cannot imagine pardon me for saying it, what idiot thinks this is a good idea or appropriate to somehow masquerade in a blackface, which is so highly offensive to the blacks of this time period and even to today. How is this okay? How is this appropriate? And yet, from time to time, pay attention, folks. Watch the news, read the news. You'll hear it. I'm just horrified. But we see this as a very common thing happening in the South. These Jim Crow laws, it's a terminology based on theater, and it's kind of these over-exaggerated laws that are going to somehow keep the blacks down under the thumb of the southern white person. In this portion, again, please do read this. I'm just kind of giving you some highlights so that you don't have to listen to a really long lecture. In this time period, you also see the rise of a concept of separate but equal. And you need to know separate but equal for your test. This is the idea that there can be separate accommodations for blacks and whites as long as they are deemed equal. Now, here's the problem. Who's going to say it's equal? Well, typically, it's the white man, which means that likely it's not going to be equal. And I don't mean that in the sense of no white man can be trusted, but it's always going to be in the benefit of the white man. In this time period, we also see the separate car law, which you need to know that for your test. This was passed, established in Massachusetts, and it essentially is this idea of separate but equal, but it's applied specifically to the use of trains or trolleys and that sort of thing, which was rising up in use during this time period. So what's this look like? Well, instead of me having to sit next to someone of an opposite color, we're going to be separated because that's going to make things so much better, right? Okay, that's sarcasm for those of you that don't know me. I use it quite a bit, so my apologies. But this separate car law is just one example or one manifestation of separate but equal. Your book talks a little bit about Plessy versus Ferguson, which you do need to know that particular case for your test. I love this case, not the outcome, because the way I look at it is the Supreme Court missed an incredible opportunity to have taken light years off the civil rights struggle, and yet they did not do that. The case of Plessy versus Ferguson essentially is the plight of one Plessy, who was a minuscule amount black, but he's still considered black, and so he buys a ticket onto a train in New Orleans, or in Louisiana, excuse me, and as he makes this journey, he gets his ticket punched. He's sitting in the white car. After his ticket is punched, he tells the conductor, oh, by the way, I'm actually black. And in this case, he gets thrown into jail. He is essentially part of this landmark court case that the Supreme Court could have come back and very easily said, you know what? This makes a really good point. We should be protecting the rights of all people. Instead, they came back and said, it's okay. Separate but equal is okay. You know what? I don't think it is, and we missed a huge opportunity right there. Certainly disappointing for me as far as the Supreme Court goes. I'm going to stop here, and we'll pick up with Chapter 4 later.